You're speaking of Millie Francis. Millie Francis was the daughter of the Red Stick Creek prophet Josiah Francis. And Millie, when she was a teenager, her family was driven out of Alabama during the Creek War. They fled to Florida to survive. The U.S. troops had destroyed their homes and their town and were pursuing them. So they came into Spanish Florida to get away from the U.S. troops, but also to try to find food. They were starving to death. Many people died, on the way down here. Millie was with her father. She wound up here when this was still the British post and lived here for about a year when the British occupied this site. And then the prophet left with the British and went to Great Britain to plead the case of the Muskogee people, to the King of England. When he left, his family remained behind in Florida, and they moved from here over to the Wakulla River near today's Wakulla Springs. And Millie lived there. When in 1818 Jackson invaded Florida, he came down here and he built Fort Gadsden. In his army were a number of Georgia militiamen. There were about 900 of them. These were volunteers from the state of Georgia. Some were drafted, some were volunteers. They came here and they helped build Fort Gadsden. One of these was a guy named Duncan McCrimmon. And Duncan was a teenager, and the legend says that Duncan decided to go fishing. I don't know, why you would decide to go outside the fort fishing during the middle of a war with the Muskogee Creek and Seminole people. I don't know, that doesn't sound real bright. And so I kind of speculate maybe old Duncan was headed back for Georgia, But whatever happened, the warriors of the prophet Francis had the fort under surveillance and they were watching it. And so when McCrimmon comes out into the woods, they capture him and they take him back to Prophetstown on the Wakulla River. Millie later said that she and her sister were playing down by the river. She was around 15 years old when they heard the war cries of the warriors in the town. So they went up into the village to see what was going on, and there was this naked white man tied to a post in the middle of the village. They were preparing to execute him. Now the legend says they were going to burn him at the stake, but Millie said they were planning a firing squad to shoot him. He was their enemy. And so she pleaded with her father, who was now back from Great Britain, to spare his life. She told him that he had no head for war, meaning he wasn't old enough to make his own decisions about such things. And her father, she said, was sympathetic, but that he told her, it's not within my power under the laws of our people, and this is true, under the laws of our people, his life belongs to the people, the warriors who captured him. And those two warriors suffered greatly during the Creek War. One of them lost his mother in the war. One of them lost his sister, I think it was, in the war. And so they're going to take his life, to get justice for their loved ones who were lost. Well, he said, I suggest you go talk to them about it. So Millie went to these two warriors, and initially they were unmoved. They said, I lost my mother, I lost my sister. This white man needs to die for what they did to my family. But Millie talked to them and convinced them that killing this young man was not going to bring their family members back. And they thought about it, and her pleadings, got to them. And so they said, okay, if he will agree to shave his head and join our tribe or our band, then we will spare his life. And so Millie went to him, and Millie could speak multiple languages. She was a very smart young woman. And she told him, if you will agree to have your head shaved, they will spare your life. And she said he stuck out his head and said, shave it all off, I don't care, spare my life. And so they did, and he had his head shaved, and they adopted him into the prophet's group. But the prophet was very worried about McCrimmon because he knew there were many people in his town who didn't necessarily agree with the decision. They had lost family members in the Creek War, and he was afraid they would kill this young man. So the prophet took him to San Marcos de Apalach, which is the Spanish fort at St. Mark's, traded him for some rum to the Spanish commandant there. It was his way of getting the young man to safety. McCrimmon was saved through Millie's intervention. This story goes out and it gets in the American newspapers and it spreads like lightning. And they're calling her a modern Pocahontas. And the story of this modern Pocahontas in Florida spreads through newspapers all over the United States. Then it spreads to Europe, and it's appearing in newspapers in Great Britain and France and in other countries. She's an instant celebrity. And I know that it's hard for us to imagine that a newspaper would make anything up, but it happened in 1818. You know, nothing like that would ever happen today, right? But the newspapers said that to show his gratitude, McCrimmon is going to go and propose marriage to her. Now, he had no plan of this. And as I understand it, he had a fiancée in Milledgeville, Georgia, who was probably not thrilled at all by this. But a feeding frenzy, this is like one of America's great media feeding frenzies, builds. And everyone expects McCrimmon to go propose to this Pocahontas of the swamps in Florida. And they start sending money and gifts to him to give to her as wedding presents. And he gets put on the spot. And so he caves in and he heads back down into Florida. And U.S. Army officers say, you know, McCrimmon passed here today and he's on his way to Fort Gadsden to meet with Millie and propose marriage to her. And when he arrived here, Colonel Matthew Arbuckle is in command at Fort Gadsden, and he sends a letter out on the first day McCrimmon arrives, and he says, McCrimmon has arrived. Millie is here. Tomorrow they're going to meet. You know, I'll send another report tomorrow. And these are Army officers sending these reports to the newspapers, and they're spreading like wildfire. And so it takes weeks to get to wherever these reports are going, but people are waiting, you know, okay, there's another one coming tomorrow. Let's see what happens, you know. And so, sure enough, the next day they meet here at Fort Gadsden, and Millie Francis meets, and Duncan McCrimmon meets, and McCrimmon thanks her for saving his life, and he proposes marriage to her. Colonel Arbuckle is watching. The troops are all watching to see what's going to happen. This is the most drama they've had here since the war ended, you know. And everyone's excited, and Millie looks at him and basically says, "Are you out of your mind? You know, I'm not going to marry you. You people came down here, you invaded, you know, you destroyed my town, you burned my home. Andrew Jackson had hanged his father, you know, the guy she was kind of dating, they had shot at a firing squad." And she's like, "Why would I marry you?" She said, "I prefer to stay with my own people." But then she said something that sent shockwaves through the United States. She said, "What I did for you, I did out of compassion and mercy. And I would have done this for anyone else in the same circumstance. So don't think you're any kind of special." You know, basically is what she told him. This was a shocking statement because most people in that day did not believe that Native Americans were capable of such civilized thoughts as mercy and compassion. And it sparked a national debate over what the heck. Some newspapers concluded that she must have been a white girl who was captured when she was so young she'd never remembered being a part of a white family because no Indian could have these kind of thoughts, they thought. Others thought, well, she was exposed a lot to the British. Maybe they, you know, developed her mind. They did not understand that Native Americans were people and that Millie Francis was a human being and that she was very capable of mercy and compassion and things like this. It started the national reconsideration of who American Indians were. It would take another 100 years almost, you know, until the great tragedy of Wounded Knee before it really dawned on the American civilization what it had done to America's Native American people. But it began then, the thought process began then.